Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to another one of my presentations. This presentation will accompany the final paper that I have written for Ling 530, Graduate Seminar on Historical Linguistics, taught by Dr. Operstein at Cal State Fullerton. The title of the presentation is Wherefore Art Thou? And it's in tribute to those pronouns that no longer exist in modern English. And as the subtitle indicates, it will be a study on the evolution of subject pronouns, particularly of the English language. However, I will be using some examples from other Germanic languages to help complete a more broad picture. So to begin, I'll begin with a presentation overview that will start with the introduction before moving on into the purpose of the presentation. Then I will give a sample of personal pronouns that are found within the Germanic family. And then I'll move on to Old English, Middle English, and then finish off with Modern English. However, for Modern English, I will be talking about some issues and some innovations that have occurred with the pronoun paradigm. And then I will finish off with conclusion and, of course, the references. So for the introduction, the English language as we know it now spans the globe, but it did not span the globe when it first was introduced. It was actually spoken in a relatively compact area. And if we look at the development of English, we can see that Germanic dialects that were known as the Teutonic dialects formed what we call English, or as what we know of English now. And these dialects were brought to the English islands between the 4th and 5th centuries. And these dialects evolved to become Old English, and they were brought to the English shores at around 450 AD. The Celts were the first people to inhabit England, or what we refer to England in the modern day, and the Celts spoke dialects that belonged to Indo-European. During the time of the Roman Empire, Latin was the language that was mostly spoken. When the Roman Empire troops withdrew, the Germanic warriors were able to take over, and they were able to invade from the North Sea. These new Germanic tribes included Angles, Saxons, Frisians, Jutes, and they conquered over, and then West Saxon is known to be the Old English dialect. Other invasions, of course, took place over this time, and one notable invasion dealt with the Danes, and that is why a lot of words now have Danish in origins with them. The one interesting thing to point out about the Old English language was the fact that it dealt with the runic alphabet. The runic alphabet was a set of symbols that were present in Old English, and then later when the Latin alphabet was introduced, there were some sounds that didn't correspond to the Latin alphabet. Therefore, a few symbols were used, include the eth, thorn, and ash. Now to move on to the purpose of the presentation. The purpose is to provide some insight behind some morphological, as well as syntactic, and phonological changes to the subject pronoun paradigm throughout the history of the English language. Now the main focus is on morphology, but I will try my best to include some ideas about the syntax of these pronouns. And most of the literature did not deal with the phonology of it, so at that time I really had to deal with the chapter that was dealing mainly on phonology to really get a better idea of how they thought the language was spoken at that time. I wanted to include morphology, syntax, and phonology to give a better picture of the subject pronoun paradigm. And the whole pronoun paradigm of the entire Germanic family is way too complex and vast for this project. Therefore, I will just simply be limiting myself to the subject pronouns. And the main focus is on English, as I already mentioned, but I will be using some other examples from other Germanic languages to help paint the better picture. So at this time, I ask all passengers on Cal State Fullerton flight number 530 to sit back with their seats and trays in the upright position. Be sure to have your backpack and supplies stowed underneath your desk and refrain from using the restrooms for the duration of this presentation. Please sit back, relax, as we travel back in time to relive subject pronouns. On the current slide, we see several different tables showcasing different subject pronoun paradigms across a few Germanic languages. There are several similarities that can be seen across all tables with the forms of pronouns, and Old English, Old Frisian, Old High German, Modern German. With the exception of Modern English, all have high case systems with unique morphologies for the pronouns. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the case system, I will briefly describe what each case does. So the nominative is used for the subject, the accusative is used for the direct object, the dative is used for the indirect object and the genitive is used for possession. So there was another case that was used for other pronouns that didn't belong to the subject pronoun paradigm, and that was the instrumental case, and that deals with the manner in which something occurs, and there are only forms for the masculine and neuter nouns. So another interesting similarity is how Old English actually is quite similar to modern German, and this can be seen with the first person singular nominative pronoun ich or ich, depending on how the sources say it should be pronounced, which sounds quite similar to the modern German correspondent ich. So Danish pronouns were not included in this chart because Danish pronouns actually do something that's quite unique to Germanic languages, and that is that they differentiate between emphatic and unemphatic pronouns. So since the focus is on English, I will not spend too much time on the other languages, but I thought it would be beneficial to at least showcase some differences and some similarities that exist across the broad pronoun paradigm for subject pronouns. So now dealing with Old English. Old English marks the distinction between singular, plural, and dual. Now we'll be getting back to dual shortly. So if we're looking at the different forms of it, I'm not going to go over every single example, but you can see that ich or ik for the nominative first case, or first person rather, is similar to the modern German but differs slightly to modern English I. Accusative me and dative me correspond generally to modern English me. Dealing with the second person nominative, thu kind of varies considerably from modern English you. And then for the third person, that's where we have a differentiation between the three genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter, which happens the same in English with he, she, and it. So for the nominative, we get he, heo, and heat. And then the genitive, he's, hire, and he's, which kind of corresponds a little bit to modern English, his, her, and its. Now dealing with plural, first person nominative we corresponds easily with modern English we. We get us for the accusative and dative, which corresponds to us. Second person again is quite different from modern English, and third person as well doesn't really correspond to modern English, they with he. And so the source is Gelderon 2006 on page 57. So Old English subject pronouns in use. So Gelderon 2006 states that the pronoun system, and especially the second person, has been quite unstable over time, and comments on the fact that the distinction between singular and plural went extinct circa 1400. So here there are two sentences, and my apologies, I'm not going to try to pronounce these sentences because I don't want to offend everyone with my Old English, which is quite rusty, but I just wanted to illustrate an example of the first sentence, subject in the plural, and then the second sentence, the subject is in the accusative case, and it's actually singular. So the first sentence here, you may hear that he gives us the power, if we believe in him, to be God's children. And then for the second sentence, that you, mighty ruler, death overpower. That death overpowers you, mighty ruler. And then German and many other languages continue to make a distinction with the pronoun for second person singular and second person plural. However, English does not make this a formal distinction, and I will get back to this later on in the presentation. But for German, du corresponds to the singular informal way, and ihr corresponds to the plural informal way. And then there's also a formal pronoun sie, which is actually the same for singular and plural. And then Baker 2007 states that dual pronouns are used to refer to two things, that is, we two, you two, and it is used to emphasize that two persons or things are being discussed. So right now there's another example. My apologies again, I'm not going to try to butcher the Old English language and offend anyone with my bad pronunciation, but the sentence translates to, if the two of us part from each other, death is ordained for me. So now just to go into a little bit of details about the syntax of subject pronouns, Smith 2009 explains that there are three possibilities of Old English element orders that can occur, and that's SP, where the predicate will immediately follow the subject, S, with some element in between it before the predicate. So where the predicate follows the subject, but there are other elements that are incorporated into the clause. And then there's PS, where the subject will immediately follow the predicate. So Germanic languages, with the exception of English, that kind of is residual V2, but all other Germanic languages are V2, and that is to say that the finite verb actually appears as the second element of a main clause. So I just wanted to give this one example that I thought was quite interesting. So an morgana ga ich to theum dunum, which translates to in morning, a literal translation, in morning go I to the hills. So in this case we have actually the verb that comes before the subject, whereas in modern English the subject in almost every case is before the verb. But like I said, Germanic languages are V2, so that actually means that the verb can appear before the subject. So I just drew the syntax trees for Old English, Modern German, and Modern English. So for Old English we get a prepositional phrase, which is kind of in the topicalization part of the tree. And then we get the verb starting the VP, and then we get the subject ich, and then another prepositional phrase to theum dunum, which corresponds actually kind of pretty much to Modern German, which we would have am Morgen gehe ich in der Berge. But however, modern English will do I go to the hills in the morning. So the in the morning actually is in the topical position for Old English and Modern German. However, in modern English, the pronoun I is found in that element, and in the morning is actually at the end of the clause. So now moving along to Middle English subject pronouns. We get Gelder in 2006 explains that the third person plural pronouns, that the initial ch had been replaced with th, and this change is attested first with the nominative case. And then Samuel's 1972 comments that they is from Scandinavian and becomes part of the language, and by the 14th century it was a minor variant compared to the other ch forms from Old English. And then Samuel's 1972 on page 115 continues the explanation, stating that there was an intermediate stage with cho and che that became sho and she, and this was the result of the heavily Norse influenced Cumberland-Yorkshire belt, which provides numerous parallels for the change. But the change is demonstrated diatopically as well as diachronically by Middle English dialect texts. So right here I just have another table of the subject pronouns that are found in Middle English. For the purpose of this presentation, I didn't go into too much detail for the changes that occurred, but definitely in the paper I explain more what Samuel's 1972 is showcasing about the different stages of the pronunciation and form of these pronouns for the female pronoun she, and then for the plural pronoun they. So for getting now to Middle English pronouns, you can see that there's actually much more similarities now with modern English. So we get we and our and you and your, and then with the plural, and then the third they, them, and their definitely corresponds with modern English. She and he, her and him, her and his. Didn't really get too much detail for the neuter, but then thou and thee definitely don't really correspond to modern English, but the me for the first person definitely corresponds more to modern English. So now dealing with Middle English subject pronouns, Gelder in 2006 on page 122 continues and explains that around 1600, ye is lost, thou and thee are used less frequently, and you from Old English, yao, become the common form. And then Smith 1999 also explains that this distinction is similar to that occurs in modern French between tu, the singular informal pronoun, and vous, the plural and formal pronoun. And he continues to explain that these pronouns had developed as the common unmarked form of address. Thou by 1600 had developed as a marked familiar form which could be used both positively and negatively. By the end of the 17th century, thou was restricted to non-standard varieties and to special kinds of religious discourse. So now just some interesting examples to showcase about Middle English. Didst thou not hear a noise? Did you not hear a noise? So you can see thou. And then you all did love him once. For you all did love him once. Now dealing with a little bit of syntax, Smith 1999 on page 113 comments, when the subject form of the second person singular pronoun is preceded by its verb, it frequently merges with that verb, which is quite interesting. And he provides the following example. So we have do you live, where you'd have the subject before the verb, but actually in Middle English, we actually have kind of the verb first, and then the pronoun actually kind of gets melded together, amalgamated with the verb. Livest thou. And then Smith 1999 on page 141 states that the impersonal construction is still in use in early modern English, but has become much restricted in use in comparison with Middle English. Only methinks and methought appear commonly in the works of Shakespeare. So an example is methinks there is much reason in his sayings. Let's begin our descent onto modern English pronouns. I trust that you are well versed on modern English pronouns, so I don't need to drill you with them. At this point of the presentation, I don't want to spend too much time, but I just want to steer more in a direction of dealing with some issues and some innovations that have occurred, not necessarily with subject pronouns, but with other pronouns in general throughout the course of the English language. So starting with Cussy and de Vogler, 2011, that states that very few dialects of English have retained the old second person singular personal pronoun thou, which definitely is the case. You're not going to walk down the street and have someone come up to you and say, hey thou. If someone were to say that to me, I'd probably think that they were lost and looking for a Shakespearean play. So definitely that's not the case, and as Cussy and de Vogler state that the second personal pronoun you is used instead. So Cussy and de Vogler, 2011, briefly describe a notion that was explained by Cussy 2003, when there is no distinction between a plural form and a singular form. So the lack of distinction has been termed horizontal homophony, and this is present not only in modern English but also in Dutch, but I will just really focus on modern English. So this is definitely the case for the second person. There is no distinction between the singular and the plural. So there is an ambiguity in deciphering the number of these pronouns, and Cussy and de Vogler have stated that 34 out of 43 varieties of English have found methods to help disambiguate between the plural and singular forms. So if we look a little bit closer to home with North American English dialects, there are two major variants that occur, and the first major variant is y'all, and the second one is you guys. So y'all is predominantly used in the deep south of the United States, and you guys is quite common anywhere in North America. And if we want to use a British equivalent, the British equivalent to this would be you lot. So now this section doesn't necessarily deal with subject pronouns, but I still thought it would be interesting just to show a little bit of extra information about pronouns in general. As I previously mentioned in the presentation, another pronoun system had another case on top of the nominative, accusative, dative, and genitive, and that was used for demonstratives and interrogative pronouns with the forms masculine and neuter for the instrumental case, meaning the manner in which something happened. There are even pronouns that actually no longer cease to exist, so I could even say, wherefore art thou man? So whatever happened to the pronoun man? So Loss 2000 explains that an indefinite pronoun man went extinct from Old English in the 15th century. However, this pronoun didn't go extinct from all languages in the Germanic family. Modern German still retains this pronoun as man, which means one. Now, this I thought was quite interesting. Expressions have now been introduced that have some pronominal sense to them. So Beavers and Kuntz Garboden 2006 explain an interesting finding behind an expression with a pronoun and ass. So an example would be, keep up the good work and copyright everything so you can sue their asses if they steal again, which is definitely the case. You actually kind of hear this expression come up quite common in speeches, and it's as if it's used as a pronoun, a subject pronoun. So in conclusion, we can see that changes have occurred with the morphology and phonology of the pronouns originating in the north, and this diffusion occurred from the north towards the south of the region. In modern English, pronouns in many cases appear before the verb, and in Old English there were a number of instances where the subject appears after the verb. Various dialects of English have included terms to help disambiguate between a singular and a plural pronoun. There is also an emergence of a new pronoun, as in the case of your ass, so who knows, maybe in 20 years, your ass might actually be a pronoun or any one of its equivalents. And then considerable changes have taken place, and this is only the tip of the iceberg for one who is wanting to paint an intricate portrait of the history behind the pronouns and the Germanic family. So I thank you very much for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me via email. My email address is right there. And I also encourage you to write any comments that you might have about the presentation in the comment section below. So once again, thank you very much for listening to my presentation.